And just sort of a few issues sort of where I position, or just a few sort of broader remarks about the project. I mean, the title is for me personally very important, Performing Germanness, because I've come around during my studies on this project from, in a sense, working on anti-Semitism in Germany to working or tracing a notion of Germanness that was defined as inherently non-Jewish in German history, and that is something quite different. So maybe it works now. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry if I'm too loud, you know, just tell me. I'm not used to working with a micro, even in the German Hörsaal, so and I might be running away from it too. And so the second thing, just to sort of to place this topic, I mean, when people talk about humor in Nazi Germany after 1945, there is one line of memory construction, and that is that humor in Nazi Germany was a feat of resistance by non-Jewish Germans. And that is an uncannily unbroken interpretation until today, in fact, no matter how much sort of the scholarly and the public reception of Nazism changed. And so it's one very unobtrusive line that argues until today that, in a sense, non-Jewish Germans were the victims of a dictatorship, and joking was a kind of resistance. And that was a way, or one way of sort of making forget everything that I'm looking at, I think, and I'm trying to unearth what other meanings humor or laughter might have had in National Socialism. So in 1938, Heinrich Himmler, national head of the SS, visited Dachau, the concentration camp serving as a model for all other camps and as a training site for the SS in the 1930s. The sports journalist Dr. Maximilian Reich, deported there from Austria after the annexation, described the visit after he could leave Dachau and flee to England. The SS turned the visit into a theater of humiliation, with Himmler's group commenting each of the commander's derisive remarks with supportive laughter. So Himmler asked an elderly businessman whether he knew why he was in Dachau, and when the man said no, the SS shook with laughter. Himmler ordered solitary confinement in a dark cell, so, I quote, the man could think about it. By laughing in theatrical fashion, the SS showed off that they saw no need to communicate, nor any necessity to explain why they persecuted human beings. Such humiliation was a recurrent feature in German society after 1933. Time and again, survivors of the Shoah have talked about Nazi humor, describing how Germans whom they met on their journeys of pain defined torture practices as jokes, and how onlookers joined in, laughing and cheering. In fact, we can read German society during the Nazi period not just as a society of persecution and as a culture turning itself into a genocidal one, but we can read it as a society of humiliation. But why? Why act out violence as a joke? To put it cynically, if you want to kill a people, you kill them. You don't need laughter for murder. In this paper, I would like to argue that both talking about and acting out laughter played a systematic role among non-Jews in Nazi Germany. Alon Confino has asked, why did the Nazis burn the Hebrew Bible? And he answered, because they wanted to eradicate the Jewish origins of Western Christian civilization. And in a similar way, I'm arguing that in their laughter, they gave a message about the meaning they inscribed into persecution and killing. They acted out their specific understanding of German history, which they framed as a history of having been humiliated and shamed, while now, as the makers of German history, they turned the imaginary around and made it come real upside down. That also meant that they enacted not just through violence, but also through laughter, their notion of Germanness, which they defined as inherently non-Jewish. I will discuss my argument by looking at two arenas of acting: Carnival parades in the 1930s on the one hand, and practices of violence on the other hand, mostly in the Shoah itself. But before I turn to those examples, I would like to present very quickly 4 arguments from the book to explain why the trope of laughter could be turned into a code of communication and a practice for producing a world without Jews, and also which meaning its theatrical character could acquire. So the first point is that the very notion of humor, the very term humor or laughter, in German culture had a very specific meaning. Normally, humor is understood as a term to cover all things deemed funny, satire, comics, caricatures, and so on. In German culture, that also works, but since the 1800s, the very term humor had also a different meaning. It meant to produce a nation through fighting. In the 1800s, intellectuals like Fichte considered the lack of a German nation after the collapse of the old empire in 1806 as tragic or serious. And so accordingly, they defined the willingness to produce a nation through fighting against Napoleon, for example, as cheerfulness. And since that time, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, the idea that true German unity would only be produced through fighting and not through democratic means, because this acquired a totally anti-democratic meaning, this idea was pinpointed in a narrative often entitled The Serious and the Cheerful, Das Ernste und das Heitere. It did not disappear after the founding of empire in 1870-71, but since then anti-democrats used it to reject democratization as a way of forming the inner nation. And so the cheerful and the serious captured what Michael Geyer has dubbed catastrophic nationalism. The idea to produce a truly united nation not through democracy but through fighting. And if you were not apt to fight, if you were too young, too old, or a woman, you could join in by presenting history and society in this appropriate way in anecdotes or jokes. Secondly, this very notion of laughter served as a binary marker to define who was considered German or not. And in German history you always have a ton of inner and outer enemies. I jump all that and all that intricate history and focus on sort of the German-Jewish issue here. Because in the 19th century and then more viciously into the 20th century, whoever wanted to exclude German Jews from this notion of Germanness I just described, ascribed them a wrong laughter. And just one example from the First World War, the infamous anti-Semitic agitator Theodor Fritsch described Jewish Germans in October 1914, right after the beginning of World War I, as the laughing third. And by ascribing laughter to them, he sharpened the stereotype that was very present in German culture of the supposedly transgressive Jewish body who would not belong to any nation but stepped across all boundaries to exploit all nations. And so Fritsch suggested, in addition, that they cheered their success, laughing down on those whose identity they supposedly mimicked, and in a sense adding shame to exploitation. And so the term humor could possibly project the Jew as a transgressive body who not only profited but was shaming and thereby emotionally hurting the imagined Germanness. And in other words, and that is the key also for sort of ways how a lot of Germans framed their history, he and his followers were portraying themselves in a sense as victims of Jewish perpetrators against Germanness. And that is one of the key phrases that the Nazis pick up when they reorganize the party in 1925 and come back after the failed coup. And they pick up sort of the cheerful and the serious and this notion of the binary laughter and to organize sort of their offer of identity. And Hitler promises since 1925 in a sense to wipe off the laughter of everybody's faces whom they define as enemies and perpetrators. So that has sort of kicks off particularly in the 1920s and 30s. Now my third point is that particularly during World War I, radical nationalists fused this humor discourse with another line of thinking about Germanness. The dominant construction of Germanness and masculinity, by the way, at that time, around 1900, was what I have called the educated artist soldier. That did not mean somebody who was actually active in any of these fields, but it meant the imagined identity of a person who supposedly integrated all realms of life in his personality, represented by key elements of German culture, namely Bildung, education in a broad sense. Secondly, somehow a sense for the arts, because the cult of art, the religion of art in German culture is as important as the cult of Bildung, of education. And thirdly, the element, the willingness to fight for the nation. So in the war of 1870-71 against France, Bismarck and the older Moltke who ran the military, they were in a sense framed as the perfect embodiments of such artist soldiers because they created the nation through warfare. And so that is the way of how war and violence is being turned into a creative force which carries on then into the 20th century. And I skip now how heatedly contemporaries fought over who might share in this symbolic bonus of the artist soldier. Just very shortly before 1914, this notion is in a sense socially elitist, so it's only upper class men who may share, but it's politically open, so also liberals and pacifists use it in order to share, to get a symbolic bonus for their politics. And what then happens in a twisted history, and the Nazis push that since 1925, they pick up that imaginary for themselves and they frame Hitler as the perfect embodiment of an artist soldier, and they narrow it down politically, so only those who follow anti-democratic and anti-Jewish politics may share in this notion of Germanness, but they throw it open socially by cutting education, which is a very important sort of element in German history, in German society, to organize hierarchies. So they don't offer a classless society, but they offer everybody might share in this symbolic bonus of Germanness wherever they are in the social status, as long as they go along with Nazi politics. And at the same time, what happens when you look at how Democrats are attacked in the 1910s and in the 1920s, they are criticized by the Nazis, by the Deutschnationale, sort of the right-wing stirrup holders, and by folkish groups. They are not only attacked as doing the wrong politics, but they are always attacked of being, in a sense, a diabolically reversed image of an artist politician. So they're always attacked on this personality and identity level of not really being sort of German. And so in Weimar, in the Weimar Republic, all those right-wing groups attack members of the so-called Weimar coalition, the supporters of the democracy, not only as what is well known as November criminals, but they attack them in an unholy trinity, as I call it. They attack them as criminals, deserters, and pimps. So they use, in a sense, a transgressive language that projects Democrats and Jews, because Weimar is always defined as a Jewish republic, that defines them as transgressive bodies in legal, military, and sexual moral terms. And so this is a language of transgression that imagines democracy, in a sense, as a space where the German nation has to prostitute itself to the Allies and, of course, to the Jews. And as a fourth issue, I would like to underline that sort of this combined notion, I mean, staging oneself as an artist soldier by acting out this particular narrative of the cheerful and the serious, served already in the First World War as a means to dissociate the notion of justice from positive law or conventions of morality. So in the First World War, the Germans factually behaved as transgressive actors in spatial and bodily terms. They broke international law by invading Belgium and subjecting civilians to deportations and forced labor, while murdering others after classifying them as francs-tireurs. Now the cheerful and the serious, in the terms of jokes and anecdotes, turns that behavior into just behavior by rewriting violence into productive and cleansing practices. And here I have just sort of, these are visualizations of a very class-biased sort of cheerful German soldier. We can go back to that, but what I want to show is this is one of the visualization practices to turn, in a sense, destructive violence into a productive form of acting. It's a figure that's very important in the First World War, sort of the cheerful German soldier tilling the soil in occupied territory and producing a new harvest. So he's, producing something new, and he's supporting and nourishing, in a sense, the occupied countries. The second visualization practice is about cleansing, and that's the smiling German soldier who is cleaning unwilling Russian prisoners of war, while the Russians complain about having basic human rights violated. So on the left, the two Russian soldiers are saying to each other, they want to build a bath for us Russians, prisoners of war. I ask you, my brother, where is international law? And so these jokes, they either make fun of international law itself, or they make fun of anybody criticizing the Germans of breaking international law. And that also means that this figure of the artist soldier was used to transfer a particular understanding of modern art or the modern artist onto politics, war, and violence. Namely, the idea in modern history that an artist needed to follow only his own intuition and not the rules governing otherwise, be they legal, political, or moral. Instead, key notions of German culture, and in this case, work and purity, which are extremely important to sort of make up Germanness, they turned destructive or desultory practices into creative behavior marked by a supposedly cheerful smile. And sort of taken together, this matrix of the imaginary, or this was the matrix of the imaginary that Weimar democracy was up against. A meaning of humor that had nothing to do with the comical, but served to either project people as transgressive bodies and perpetrators against Germanness, or to turn factually transgressive actors who were dubbed as German into just creators of a new society. And that, of course, wasn't accepted by the whole of society, but it constituted a reservoir, an archive in a sense, of narrative strategies to dissociate the meaning of justice from law and morality, and to not only criticize others as going wrong in politics maybe, but to withhold Germanness from them. And the Nazis, since 1925, they picked up all of these terms and they radicalized them. For example, not only defining violence in war as an art, but they define violence in society against democracy and against Jews as an art that was used to create a different society. And they positioned themselves and their followers as the victims of all others whom they defined as perpetrators, using the binary notion of laughter and the mentioned language of transgression to mark Democrats, the left, and Jews as non-German. And in turn, in a sense, what they do, what they offer their followers is that they offer their followers, in a sense, to turn them from the sort of the losers of 1918, when Germany lost the war. They promise to turn them into the winners of history again, and they ask them to perpetrate violence for that, but they offer at the same time that they can act as perpetrators without having to feel as perpetrators, because the notion of perpetrator is always stuck to the other side. So, you know, they act as victims, or they present themselves as victims while acting as perpetrators themselves, because they always project that label to the other side. I just have a few of sort of the visualizations how sort of Hitler himself is being associated with that kind of a cheerful laughter, and the one from 1930 on the left, in a sense, that envisions him as sort of a bourgeois man, you know, with a hat, which is a sign for sort of a middle-class man in a suit, inviting onlookers to laugh together with him about a newspaper where he is reading all the attacks on him in a self, you know, and he looks, it's the only picture I know where he really looks at people. It's a very interesting one, and also the circle there suggests sort of a harmonic and a perfect figure. And then in 1933-34, that's one of those books that publish international caricatures about Hitler and circulate them in Germany, giving them a different meaning, in a sense, appropriating the power of definition over caricatures about the Nazis. And then that same picture is reprinted on a volume in 1935, but without sort of the spare attacking intellectuals on the right side. So it signifies, in the sense, that the Nazis have established their power, there's nobody left. And I just entered that one from 1988, because that is one of the most famous iconic images in the Nazi period itself. And when then in the 1970s and 80s, when West Germany is once again obsessed with left-wing violence, you know, a lot of old Nazis publish their memoirs, or they publish books that circle around the notion of laughter, Lachen Hitler. And that is one of the key terms. And that was one very young officer in the Waffen-SS during the war, who between the 1950s and 80s toured West Germany as a right-wing cabaretist, and then publishes that stuff in the 1980s. And so just, you know, so you can see how it was visualized. But the two arenas of acting after 1933 I now want to look at were different forms of acting out the imaginary I have just described. members of majority society turned an imagined history of having been exploited and chained by Jews, and Democrats allowing them to do so, into the power to exploit and shame. And in two forms. They either enacted the various steps of persecution themselves once more after having done them, impersonating the role of the affected themselves, or they forced the persecuted to bodily enact the new hierarchies, turning a derisive system of signs into lived pain. Now, Carnival, as my first point, as a yearly ritualized entertainment, was heavily boosted by the new elites. It was turned into a tourist attraction, yielding ever higher economic gain. The NS organization dealing with tourism, aptly named Strength Through Joy, offered cheap tickets, stores closed early, and workers received time off. To be sure, the regime tightened its grip by creating one national organization in 1936. More tellingly, maybe, they forbade wearing the uniform or using the so-called German greeting during festivities, trying hard to prevent collective laughter at or about Nazi symbols. But most carnival associations had been very conservative to begin with, and, as recent studies have shown, far from being a harbor for resistors, they only became upset when Nazi elites tried to run their show. Photographs demonstrate prominent topics since 1933: forced emigration, the loss of property and all business contacts, and the loss of rights. I just have one from Singen in southwest Germany in 1934, and that's the local rifle organization staging the forced emigration of Jews. That's another one from Singen in 1938, and this is very typical, people wearing these papier-mâché Jewish noses, which you can obviously buy in all sizes. And in the Bielefeld edition of this book, somebody tore out exactly that piece, I think, where it shows one of the members participating there. And one I want to focus on for a moment, that is in Marburg in Hesse in February 1936. A float enacted forced immigration with the title "On to Palestine," here on the bottom. An additional poster added, that's the one you see on the right, only 10 marks 50 are to pay ASAP to the city treasurer for amusement tax. That could either suggest the trope of Jewish exploitation, or rather celebrate the ability to rip off those forced to emigrate. For example, with the Reichsfluchtsteuer, the rich escape tax, introduced originally before 1933 not to hit Jewish emigres, but it was scaled down after 1933 to achieve just that. Lay actors wore clothing and beards, suggesting Orthodox or Ostjuden, Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe, implying that German Jews had never belonged to Germanness and now their mask was being torn off. In Nuremberg at the same time, local butchers took part in a float organized by the Guild of Meat Producers. They staged how contacts between Jewish and non-Jewish businessmen were a thing of the past. Activists used body language, sidelocks, and artificial Jewish noses to produce difference. The heading "Es war einmal," which you read on the left side there, "Once upon a time," was known in German culture as the introductory sentence for fairy tales, with a good ending for the good and a bad for the bad. The float acted out how guild members had turned their personal fairy tale, having been exploited and chained by Jews, into a happy ending for themselves. As Eric Sandner reminds us, bodies do not only represent social order, but are the site of the ultimate experience of symbolic structures. In the process of producing sociality, the body itself can be made into the carrier of the image that people want to project of themselves and others. Furthermore, laughter is an effective means to confirm ascriptions and make them stick. Ritual degradation operates through an inner public that might consist of just 2 people, as it did in the camps later, but in these cases of many more. These floats were moving pictures of bodies in public, like a film on the street. The actors translated their understanding of past, present, and future into live tableau, staging themselves as winners by acting out losers' role. That goes beyond other communicative meanings involved as well. For one, parades advertised the increasing self-empowerment of the non-Jewish self. Also, they drew a crowd of spectators into shared social knowledge, whether onlookers agreed or not. But in addition, I think, participants as experts of ritualized entertainment and political storytelling made their power felt by playfully transgressing boundaries they defined as insurmountable for the persecuted. First by stepping into a supposedly transgressive body, and then by stepping out of their clothing and proving themselves to be winners over difference. By impersonating stereotyped Jews, float members also brought the persecuted back into a space from which they had already been excluded, inscribing messages into human beings that were not allowed to answer for themselves anymore, and by the very practice of laughing down on them, letting the knowledge echo that they could not answer for themselves. Just like jokes, and I mean this is contextualized by just a mass amount of joke production by any person or organization you can think of, and jokes were always offered as a way to act as an artist soldier in the everyday life. And so just like jokes, Carnival was understood as a possibility to achieve the highest status of Germanness. In case somebody missed the point, for the parade in Munich in 1935 in which a tank showed up, an article in a newspaper spelled it out. After raising the rhetorical question whether it was not counterintuitive to connect Carnival and the military, the paper explained that there was no difference between the clown and the soldier. Rather, society would then be integrated fully when nobody could detect anymore who was what. So whoever performed theatrically their rising power to hurt in a dialogue-closing way defined as entertainment, that they created Germanness by exclusion, received the ultimate laurel wreath for the symbiosis of art and fighting. And in the book, I analyze Carnival in relationship to Hitler's speeches, because that's what he's doing since 1925. He's acting out his political offer like a comedian on stage, in mocking dialogues with the non-present enemies that he's attacking. And then he's sort of practicing a laughter with his audience, where his audience comes in when he leaves sentences open and gives clues that they know after a couple of years, and everybody is expecting them already, and then readily coming in with either saying something, yes, drive them out, or just laughing. And so they are already sort of organizing this threesome sort of situation where two partners laugh together about a certain position, a third absent enemy, whom they call an enemy, and so it's practiced in the Weimar Republic, and that gains just wide reception in the Nazi period itself. It's being picked up by prominent radio speakers. Hans Fritzsche, for example, it's his sign to do these mocking dialogues, for example, with a sort of, always has these staging dialogues with Duff Cooper, the British foreign minister, and acts that out on the radio and making fun of all the allies in the war. And after the war goes bad a little bit for the Germans, his audience, just stop this, stop it, they will be making fun of us in a minute, or in two months after they've beaten us again. But it's just a practice that gains sort of, that really takes hold in Germany. Now in Carnival floats, non-Jewish activists embodied those whom they defined as perpetrators. In my second set of examples, they took the enactment of their history further. They forced the persecuted to enact transgressive bodies. That distortion had characterized already the pillory processions as another form of public humiliation that Michael Wild has worked about. Jews and non-Jews since 1933 were marched through the streets, either carrying self-accusing cardboards around their necks or having to accuse themselves loudly, audibly, having to sing self-mocking verses, etc. In terms of a history of the senses, they had, through their voice, the definition of perpetrator written into their bodies as the only legitimate way of speaking up and being heard. And having to act as if they were losers of history, perpetrators, and transgressing German values, that was the key to humiliation practices going on since 1933, broadening in scope with the pogrom of 1938 and then the war. And this is in a sense the performative dimension of what Shaw Friedland and Jeffrey Herf have described, that during the Shoah, Nazi propaganda projected ever more aggressively the persecuted as perpetrators and as the guilty. Of course, that logic allowing non-Jewish Germans to portray themselves as victims. One example from 1933 shows how carefully the SA staged their story of winner and loser. The Berlin SA took Rubin Weinmann and Horst Rosenzweig as prisoners, whom they accused of having reproduced illegal brochures. For that occasion, they put up a picture of Friedrich Ebert on the wall, the Social Democratic first president of the Weimar Republic, and forced Weinmann to say a few Hebrew words in front of it. Then he had to bow to 5 SA men and, among other things, sing a song that repeated the phrase, "Why am I so sad? I could be an Iranian book tomorrow." Or, "Why am I so sad? The Nazis caught me. I could be dead tomorrow." Then both men had to dance a nigger dance, as the SA called it, and finally the SA shaved Rosenzweig's head, and when he bled because they cut him, they forced Weinmann to lick off the blood. The references were carefully selected to organize the intersubjective relations between them. The SA used the typical threesome of enemy references that they identified with each other, Social Democrats, blacks, and Jews, and forced the captives to loudly confirm the newly created system. By describing himself as sad in the song, Weinmann had to confirm that the SA now had the power to hurt, while he had to let himself be hurt, to use Heinrich Popit's terms to define power. Weinmann and Rosenzweig had to enact sad Jewish losers overcome by cheerful non-Jewish victors. And how radically the SA translated their stereotyped images into humiliating experience showed the last instance. When Weinmann had to lick off Rosenzweig's blood, the SA forced him into the image of a bloodthirsty Jew. Since 1938, this kind of torture was turned into a wide field of so-called entertainment, extended to all Jewish victims. One practice in concentration camps, dubbed as a joke, turned inmates into perpetrators by playing with concrete spatial limits, demonstrating that power over space meant power over identities. The SS forced inmates to cross lines they were not allowed to go beyond, and then killed them for transpassing the boundary. The French artist and resistance fighter Charlotte Delvaux survived Ravensbrück and Auschwitz-Birkenau. She watched how the SS ordered prisoners to go beyond the chain of guards, shot them when they did so, and in her words, I quote, laughingly checked the game. Unquote. By theatrically acting out the killing as a joke, those in power positioned themselves as artists to claim the right to do as they did. And that's also a career springboard, because the studies that we have show that sort of the theatrical acting out of power in little sketches is often done by those men who are in a position that allows for a career in the SS, and so they are offering themselves as sort of the best embodiment of a Nazi German. Another case in point is the well-known category of work. We are familiar with the derision involved in Jews having to clean streets with toothbrushes. Then the inscription Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, as an entrance to the concentration camps, plus the empire of forced labor. In addition, though, Germans in power let their story of identity and history become true by forcing the persecuted to do supposedly meaningless work. Civilians caught at the front lines or inmates in different camps had to carry sand, mud, or sacks of straw and wet salt this way and that without an apparent purpose, except to be able to force them into meaningless activity. That happened also in context where forced labor had already set in. Gertrud Deák from Hungary survived Auschwitz-Birkenau. When their forced labor had to stop due to a lack of supply, she said, they had to gather stones and make piles of them at a certain place, only to take them apart again and begin anew elsewhere. Again, I think inmates were supposed to prove the stereotype inscribed into a body framed as Jewish. They had to demonstrate that they did not create lastingly, but only destroyed. In addition to Arbeit macht frei, the SS plastered camp streets with panels saying that the, I quote, the path to freedom moves along the milestones of, and then they listed so-called German virtues like honesty and cleanliness. For the inmates, this meant freedom through death, as a man in Sachsenhausen commented, by rhymingly adding to the Arbeit macht frei, ja in Krematorium 3, yes in the crematory number 3. As my last example, the dirt in the camps and the ghettos was another means to turn an imagined boundary into a visible and lived and felt difference. The Polish resistance fighter Pelagia Lewinska summarized her 20 months in Auschwitz with the term mud. She was horrified by the dirt she was forced to live in and quickly realized that it was not produced by disorder. Rather, she perceived it as a plan to let Jewish prisoners drown in mud and their own excrements, both to break their sense of self and to celebrate winners' laughter. Mary Douglas has argued that dirt does not signify disorder in a society that works with the projection of dirt to create hierarchies. Rather, in such a society, dirt symbolizes the very ability to control what has been represented as dangerous with that metaphor to begin with. To achieve that feeling of control, however, the process needs to be done to make some other identity dissolve into something that the doers do not have to recognize as an identity any longer. And so the very process of repeating that is important in Mary Douglas' eyes, just like it was in Carnival. Zachary Sneak, SMG, has followed Douglas with the remark that the process to create what is called order is the more satisfying for those who do that, the more dangerous the other appears. In other words, the higher the drop or the greater the danger is projected to be, the higher the satisfaction to be able to make an identity marked as dangerous dissolve into mud. These arguments can be applied to the way how people in power produced and acted out hierarchies during the Shoah. The notion of dirt had been used since the 19th century to mark Jews as non-German. In their systematic destruction of Jewish monuments or sites of memory in occupied Eastern Europe, including cemeteries, the German occupation used every chance to associate the persecuted with taboo dirt. They turned the graves of religious leaders who were considered holy into latrines, dirtying the last resting place of leading figures with a humiliating meaning. In the camps, they went one step further. Here, they forced the inmates to dirty themselves and others. Because according to Lewinska, the latrines in Auschwitz were constructed in a way that made it almost impossible not to do so. In terms typical of survivors' records, Lewinska also noted that the SS, I quote, with their well-cultivated sense of humor, pushed each woman deeper into the dirt whom they had seen move slowly or with difficulty already. According to her, the SS turned each human being into a ridiculous monster of mud, so that the inmates themselves could barely look at each other without revulsion. Therefore, Lewinska understood the mud to represent, I quote, a purpose and meaning for Auschwitz, unquote. Inmates had to make the projection of dirt come alive, in just live tableau, if you want, in order to prove, to justify the projection of a difference that could never be proven. To conclude, in Nazi Germany, there was an endless supply of the cheerful and the serious, in texts, films, comedies, by media professionals, the army, the SS, or ordinary Germans with no function. And many of them affirmed explicitly the power of shaming as a tool for emotionalizing politics, because the mode of moral outrage in which the Nazis projected others as perpetrators could heighten their sense of belonging, whereas the notion of shame, or the feeling of shame, did not necessarily bind people together as an assertive group, but might make them more solitary. Wilhelm Plyer, an author from the Sudetenland, told his German audience in 1941 that he and his comrades had won the Sudetenland for Germany because they had bolstered their self-esteem by laughing down on the Czech and by weakening their opponent's self-confidence through shameful caricatures. Laughter in German society after 1933 could certainly have many meanings, also covering shock, discomfort, or the willingness to resist. However, the actors I looked at acted out Plyer's meaning. They also turned their desired form of Germanness into a felt experience for body and senses. By theatrically staging persecution as entertainment, non-Jewish Germans rendered plausible in their own eyes what they did by evoking an imagined history of having been shamed and now mockingly turning it upside down. By defining violent derision as an art, they established themselves as artist soldiers, claiming to create a new society and thereby rightfully following their own laws. I certainly don't like using this term of the artist soldier here because it can, it really bears the danger of sacralizing that in any case, but it does capture contemporary self-understanding, which was a hermetic, self-referential self-representation with which non-Jewish Germans allowed themselves to act as perpetrators without understanding themselves as such. Repetitive acts of humiliation allowed them to re-feel having won. Photographs of perpetrators standing next to dead bodies serving as second best and repetitive memory after the fact. Familiar notions of German culture structured those practices. As I pick up here on scholars like George Mosse and Sigmund Baumann, my point is that these categories had had a long history of being used for different ends. Already during World War I and the Weimar Republic, contemporaries used them to dissociate the understanding of justice from law and morality, way before the regime after 1933 forbade any alternative readings forcibly. The history of the Bielefeld series should rather make us wary of a sometimes still hidden modernization theory concerning the Shoah in German history. At least in German historiography and certainly in the German public, they are still sometimes read as an aberration from German culture. But the Bielefeld series had mapped the inner structure of German culture in a non-democratic way for a long time, translating the ascription of work and purity into the ascription of being just and right, and their opposite terms into being at fault. I certainly don't opt for a deterministic history, rather the reverse. The continued and seemingly marginal presence of such thinking that could be appropriated and radicalized when circumstances and actors allowed. I would rather go back and check the norms of bourgeois culture again, looking for the symbolic upgrading of violence in creating Germanness. Because that's, I think, what we need to understand. We need to understand how violence was symbolically upgraded not only as a supposedly legitimate means, but as a creative modern force, making the judgment of acting dependent on the question whether somebody fulfilled the cultural criteria for Germanness. Furthermore, understanding the Shoah as an empire of shaming, it seems like an endless web of intersubjective relations, far from a bureaucratic entertainment endeavor. No matter how short in time interactions were, or whether there was any direct involvement beyond seeing something happen or participating in the laughter when being told. Relationships of humiliation were designed to touch bodily and emotionally before killing. The affected, in turn, had to come up with the extra strength to bear the sense of a stolen shame, die geraubte Scham, as Ruth Klüger has called it. Boris Neumann has studied the language of misrepresentation in German society in Nazi times, where the word life meant through the death of others. The cheerful in the series turned out to be a map of action for those who staged their power to make and break identities through pain distorted into entertainment. Thank you.